Hello, and welcome to Insurrection with Brent and Lengel, formerly carried on the Starcom radio network, now carried on my YouTube channel because I decided to do that. And I am joined with my longtime friend, Caleb Maupin. Caleb, how you doing?
I'm great. How about yourself?
I'm terrific. It's been a great couple of days. The channel just surpassed 1,000 subscribers, which was my goal. I wanted to get it done before the end of August, but before mid-September, that's close enough.
Right.
Yeah. So we've grown really quickly. I have you and a couple of other people really to thank for that. So thank you, Caleb, and thanks to your followers who've also gotten interested in the content that I'm putting out. And I just finished a debate with Milton Friedman, Milton Friedman's son, David D. Friedman, which went really well. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to watch that yet or not.
I haven't had the chance yet. No.
Okay, if you do get the chance, we should totally watch it and talk about it because it was probably I fought the final boss of anarcho-capitalism.
Right. Well, he's famous. I know Milton Friedman's son is very famous for being an anarcho-capitalist, right?
Mm-hmm. He's one of
first to use the term, or
say what?
Is he the first to use the term?
No, that would be Murray Rothbard. But I would say he's probably the smartest anarcho-capitalist out there. And he's unique in that he makes a consequentialist case for anarcho-capitalism, whereas most ANCAPs are very deontological focused, where they'll essentially try to come up with rules and try to run society on sort of a moralistic notion of non-aggression, as opposed to, really kind of digging into, is anarcho-capitalism actually a good way to run things? But that's not the topic of today's stream, so we can definitely do that in the future.
Right.
What I wanted to talk with you about, and this is an important one for me to talk with a Marxist about, because I want to talk with you about one of my personal heroes, Buenaventura Durruti. Longtime viewers of my channel will notice that this particular book is actually what my gargoyle sits on in the background in most of my things. And this is one of this particular biography of Durruti, and it is ginormous. This is by Abel Paz. Abel Paz he was 15 when the Spanish Revolution and the Spanish Civil War happened. And he fought with the anarchists as a child, wound up having to eventually flee Spain when the fascists won, and returned in 1942 to fight against Franco as a guerrilla. He wound up being in prison for quite a while for his anti-fascist activities. He is frankly a fascinating historian. So, when I first got interested in anarchism, it was really revolutionary Spain that drew my attention. There was something really compelling about the Spanish anarchists and about the circumstances surrounding the Spanish Civil War. And the first source that I sort of turned to was George Orwell. Because he fought with the POUM, and I've been doing a series on Homage to Catalonia with Bobby of the Mustache Mafia podcast, talking about that in sort of a long form. And you can't really read Orwell, and you can't read about the Spanish Civil War without hearing the name Durruti. Specifically Buenaventura Durruti, who is, in my estimation, he is essentially the anarchist Che Guevara. And it's important to me to also read this with a Marxist, because interestingly enough, Durruti and the Durruti column and a lot of his anarchist contemporaries, Francisco Ascaso and Oliver, were actually accused of being Bolsheviks, or having their anarchism more like Bolshevism. That was sort of the further left critique of who they were and what they did. So I thought that this would be just an interesting historical figure to talk about his life and eventual death, and to get your impression on it. So are you ready to dig in?
Sure.
All right, amazing. And as you guys can see, we will not be able to go over everything in Durruti, because this book that I have here, as I was doing it for my this is ginormous, and I have it marked and highlighted throughout the entire thing, largely because as I said, I was doing this as research first for a play and then a screenplay that I wrote about the life of Buenaventura Durruti. So Buenaventura Durruti was born to a socialist family. His father identified as a libertarian socialist. And one of the first things was that he was apprenticed to a mechanic and blacksmith named Melchor Martinez that taught Durruti like how to literally like medieval style blacksmithing. Because, you know, fascinatingly enough, the Spanish Civil War sort of existed at this time where Spain was in a period of transition where aspects of feudalism were still there. The latifundian system, where there were large landowners who essentially ruled like nobles, and the most of Spain was like agrarian peasants. But then they were also moving into the they were moving into the modern mechanized era. So it was this era of very strong contradictions within like where technology was, but also where Spain was politically, socially, technologically. And so he was first trained as a blacksmith. And one of the first lessons that Melchor Martinez imparted on the young Durruti was that it didn't just take strength to shape the steel. You actually had to have intelligence and patience, and you had to wait until the steel was red hot and direct your blows carefully, and only then will it take the form that you want. Melchor also famously said, essentially, when Durruti's parents took him to Melchor, he said, "I will teach your son to be a master blacksmith, but I will also teach him to be a socialist." And this sat well with the family and also with young Durruti. Durruti was incredibly intelligent. He was big for his age. And his mother actually wanted him to be essentially a scholar. But Durruti insisted that he be a worker like his father. And so from a very young age, he's being trained by, this mentor. And the first time that he's raised very much in like a revolutionary climate, because Spain around this time they're being utterly torn apart by war in Morocco, as Spain tries to hold on to its colonies. And one of the big things is that like Durruti talks in his memoirs. He says specifically, like in a letter to his sister, Rosa, "Since my most tender age, the first thing I saw around me was suffering, not only in our family, but also among our neighbors. Intuitively, I had already become a rebel. I think my fate was determined then." And this is very much, he goes on to talk. I use a line in the screenplay that I'm writing about Durruti, and I use a lot of his actual words, that he remembers his grandfather punching his legs because the grandfather had caught polio or something similar to that in anger, as his sons, as his grandchildren were like sent off to war in Morocco while the rich Spaniards bought workers' sons to take their own children's place. So we really see like a high level of class antagonism between the Spanish ruling class and the workers themselves. And this comes to a head with Durruti when he is part of a miners' strike that goes on, in which Francisco Franco, the eventual fascist dictator of Spain, was deployed against the striking miners, and they used machine guns on them and killed dozens of people, if I'm not mistaken. And this was something that Durruti encountered very, very young. So it does seem like right off the bat, like he is being set up as a smart, exceptional child from the very beginning, who is interested in socialism, interested and possesses a great deal of class loyalty, to kind of be set up for the life of a revolutionary. I mean, all of the material conditions around Spain seem to be pushing him in that direction. Now, I know you've read a lot about revolutionary figures. Does this history sound familiar to you, or does Durruti seem to more stick out in comparison to other major revolutionary figures?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that Spain is in a different phase of historical development than most of Europe because of the Spanish Inquisition. While the rest of Europe had been having the Reformation, in Spain, they had, the Catholic Church had remained intact, and they had ruthlessly crushed any reforming, progressive, scientific elements. And the Spanish Inquisition was very, very ugly, and that the consequences of that were long lasting, and that that the Reformation was really the beginning of the overturning of feudalism in Europe, right? With with Martin Luther, with everything that went on in Switzerland, among the Swiss people, with Ulrich Zwingli, and it all kind of opened that. And Spain never went through the Reformation. The Catholic Church kept its grip on Spain, and so feudalism was much more thoroughly intact. The other thing that's interesting is the guilds, right? You talk about blacksmiths. The guilds were a big part of feudalism, right? Because in feudalism, you still need somebody to make the knight's armor. Right. You still need somebody to work metal, even though it's largely an agrarian economy, and that these guilds were kind of essential in the feudal order. And that part of what kept the Dark Ages going for so long with so little technological progress was that a lot of these guilds had a rule that you could not improve technology, that the craft could not be changed. Right. That the way you must keep doing it that way. And that part of the Renaissance was the breakthrough where they started changing those rules in the guilds. So you could make steel more efficiently, and you could, do things that guilds did in a more efficient manner. And I think that's particularly interesting. What I can't help but point out that, who else was the son of a socialist blacksmith? It was none other than Benito Mussolini. Right?
Really?
Yes, Benito Mussolini's father was also a socialist and also a blacksmith. So, but that was a skilled trade back then, right? You were not a peasant on the land. You were not an aristocrat. You were a craftsman. You were a worker. And there were very few people that did that, but it was a very good position to be in. You had job security your whole life, right? There was no danger of starving to death. They were always going to need somebody to do it. And the guild would make sure that your job was protected. They would never let, another blacksmith starve. So it's not like it is now, where it's just, like a plumber goes out, he gets work, he doesn't get work. It wasn't like that at all. He was always working. And that's something to think about. And that in a way you could almost argue that's the middle class in feudalism, right? The ruling class is the aristocracy, the peasantry, and the craftsmen are kind of the middle class of feudalism. So that's kind of interesting that he played that role. And
also the fact that you can see the middle class values in a lot of middle class, social climbers, and you can see his mother wanting him to move up from the middle class to being a scholar. And I honestly think, with as brilliant as Durruti was, I think he would have made an incredible scholar, but also I don't think he would have been happy in that role. I think because we'll find out more about him as we go forward, but
he would have had to know mathematics to be a blacksmith, right? He would have been able to measure things, and he would have to have do calculations in order to do that job. So he would have had to have been more educated than the average person was, just in order to do that job. You don't think of that. You think of that as being a manual labor kind of job, but compared to the average peasant, he had to be able to take out and measure pieces of metal. He had to measure temperature probably and get things hot. Like he had a level of education that was not, normal for the average person in a semi-feudal society.
Absolutely. Now he joined a number of unions very quickly and became active in the CNT. He observed with some pleasure that he was able to agitate the union leaders. So he was actually pissing off like the older union leaders that were with him, who criticized him for his revolutionary insistence. They urged him to be more patient, but Durruti responded by saying that socialism is either active or it isn't socialism. And that's something that's like very big with Durruti. He's very much a person who walks the walk. I also get the impression about Durruti that as he, like the way people talk about him, and not just Abel Paz, but the other sources that I've looked into that have talked about him. He's a man of like boundless energy. When everybody else is like passing out, he's up and he's like, go, 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 go. I sometimes wonder if he might have been a manic depressive personality type, because the constant boundless energy that they have, and also crossed with the fact that like, he was in this incredibly dark time. And oftentimes people who suffer from depression tend to have a more accurate picture of actually what's going on than necessarily neurotypical people. For instance, Abraham Lincoln was known to suffer from major depression. And there's a lot of historical scholars who say that Abraham Lincoln may not have been able to lead the country through the American Civil War had he not been experienced with dealing with these incredibly dire circumstances every day because of just the way his brain processed the world. It's just an interesting aspect of it. But yeah, so the troops were called out. They used a machine gun, and instead, this was the 1917 general strike. The revolt was revolutionary, unanimous, and complete throughout Spain. I don't know if anything like it had occurred elsewhere in the world. Hundreds of workers fell through the peninsula, but it began without a concrete goal, kind of like Occupy Wall Street, and lasted a week. The heroic workers of the Austrians prolonged it for 8 additional days. And the repression was severe. Troops were called out, and they used their machine guns against the strikers. The troops were thought to have behaved barbarously, and the armory with the king was the only real power in the country at the time. And we've seen this a lot. I mean, there was, like, you think about the Blair Mountain, the Battle of Blair Mountain in America, when they literally dropped bombs on striking workers. There was the thing that happened in South Africa where troops fired on striking miners. This is a something that has played out multiple times in recent history.
Yeah. Well, I know there was a famous American mine owner, I don't remember which one, who said you can't operate a coal mine without machine guns. That's the quote. And then I think it was the same coal miner that also said he could hire half the working class to shoot the other half. And it's particularly, that happened, right? These coal miners would go out on strike, and then they would get shot at. That's Big Bill Haywood. That's just the history. I mean, going back for thousands of years, and miners were known for being rather militant, but they were also known for facing some of the harshest conditions. I mean, mining coal, even today with all our technology, is a really dangerous job, and it's a really, really not fun job. It's very hot down in the mines, and it's and we continue to hear. I mean, how many coal accidents are there that we hear about? You turn on the news, and there's like 5 coal miners are missing, and they are able to rescue one, able to rescue another. I mean, even today, it's very dangerous. Imagine what it was like before the technology and before safety regulations and such. So.
And even then, and then you get stuff like black lung. That was a huge issue. So, what wound up happening was that Spain was in a huge amount of turmoil, and they had already lived through one fascist dictatorship, that of Primo de Rivera. So in 1922, inspired by Mussolini, King Alphonse XIII of Spain thought he could solve the country's problems by imposing another fascist general who would subdue the country and permit him to reign in peace. So he went to a guy by the name of Sanchez Guerrera and basically said, I'm going to make you the new prime minister of Spain. And, you're going to be the new fascist dictator, and I'll just get to be king and continue to, just live the lifestyle that I have grown accustomed to. But the interesting thing about this was that as soon as the power was handed over to Sanchez, he actually formed the government of a social truce and reestablished constitutional guarantees in 1922. So he pulled sort of a Smedley Butler. We saw this in the United States when Roosevelt did the New Deal. A number of very rich, influential families came to General Smedley Butler and said, we want you to rule. We'll keep FDR on as a figurehead, and you'll be the new fascist general that runs the new fascist USA. And Smedley Butler went, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Hang on for just a second. And then went straight to Congress and was like, hey, they wanted me to take over the country. What are you guys going to do about it? And of course, because it's America, and in America, rich people do not go to jail, the congressional inquiry determined that, in fact, this was a real plot. that they were attempting to overthrow the United States government and make the United States a fascist nation. But no one was punished. No one went to jail. Everyone got away with it. And they just sort of forgot that it happened.
And the media downplayed it. The New York Times said it wasn't real, or it was weird. It was on the congressional record. The congressional investigation determined it was real, but somehow the media gave the impression this was all just a rumor or something. It was very strange. You read the press reports about it. It's very, very strange the way it was covered in American media. It was almost like they feared too much alarm or something. They didn't want they didn't want to further the unrest. I understand the American Legion was supposed to be involved in that, right? It was supposed to be the American Legion that would go.
Yeah. Well, it was so there was a bonus army at the time. Basically, there were soldiers that had come back and they were owed a bonus. That was never paid, that wasn't being paid by the government. So they were owed all this money, and they actually were doing their own kind of Occupy Wall Street, where they went and camped out like in parks. I believe this was in Washington, D.C. And basically said,
it was led by the Communist Party. Yeah. Yeah. Go on.
Yeah. And so with regard to Smedley Butler, what the rich people were hoping was that he would lead this bonus army to take over the country, because these soldiers were obviously, one, trained to fight, and two, like dissatisfied. So, and Smedley was well liked among them. It's very interesting that they, didn't understand communism and socialism that much, that they thought that the soldiers would just jump up and be fascists, and they thought that Smedley Butler would be down with being a fascist. It makes me wonder, like, if they just thought he could be bought, or if they just were completely politically illiterate.
Well, I mean, 1931 is when the famous bonus army incident took place, right? And that was this huge gathering, and I believe Abraham Lincoln's grandson was one of the leaders of it, and the Communist Party was involved. But they were occupying the National Mall with their tents, and then it was forcibly cleared, and 4 people died, and it was very ugly. But the business plot wasn't until 1933. So perhaps the idea was that they would call another bonus demonstration, this time led by fascist sympathizers. A lot of times, though, when you have coups, you have demonstrations that are taking place, but then you also have sections of the actual live military that take action under the chaos created by demonstrations. So it could have been that they were going to maybe manipulate some kind of left-wing demonstration to happen in the Capitol and all of that. And then under the cover of that, the military would move in and seize the government. And that happens.
Absolutely. It also may have been that I'm misremembering it, and that he became famous through the bonus army, and then that's what attracted them to him. But either way, I'm going to jump back to Spain.
Sure.
And as I said before, Durruti oftentimes was accused of being more Bolshevik-like in his approach to anarchism. And so I wanted to read this part here. Durruti's view of the anarchist role and the professional revolutionaries was the complete opposite. It was the complete opposite of another friend of his, Francisco. For him, the proletariat was the real leader of the revolution, and if anarchists had a significant impact, it was only because of their radicalism. The great theorists, he argued, drew their ideas from the proletariat, which is rebellious by necessity, and given its condition as an exploited class. Above all, the struggle should rest on the solidarity, and militants must recognize that the proletariat has already found the vehicle for its liberation by itself, through the Federation workshop and the factory groups. For Buenaventura, they would only adulterate the proletariat's maturation if they turned themselves into, quote, professional revolutionaries. What anarchists had to do was understand the natural process of rebellion and not separate themselves from the working class under the pretext of serving it better. That would only be a prelude to a betrayal of the bureaucratization and a new form of domination. So that, at least, is Durruti's view on revolutionary politics. And it's interesting because it seems like he is kind of rejecting the idea of a vanguard party necessarily. But at the same time, because of his emphasis on action, he is, and his friends are essentially acting as a vanguard party in a number of times, which led to the accusation that they were Bolsheviks. Now, what's your thought of that in terms of like revolutionary theory? How does that fit in?
Well, a couple things. First of all, his focus on the proletariat is certainly more Marxist, and that in this era, it seemed like anarchists were more identified with the peasantry and the liberation of the peasantry. So, he comes out of you mentioned the CNA, which was a syndicalist organization.
Yeah, CNT.
Right? Yeah, the CNT, right? And so it was about labor unions, but rejecting political action. The idea being that direct action on the job is the focus. We're not going to try to build a Marxist party to seize the state. We're going to try to have the workers seize their factories. That was the syndicalist movement. In Spanish, the word for labor union is sindicato. And syndicalism and anarcho-syndicalism is the movement for labor unions, basically. And the other thing that's interesting is, it seems like he very much believes in spontaneity. And in Lenin's book, What Is to Be Done, which is considered like it's the book where he lays out the vision for building the Bolshevik Party, he argues against spontaneity. He says, left to its own devices, the working class is only capable of developing a trade union consciousness, that you need a vanguard party to make the proletariat capable of seizing power. They can't do it spontaneously. And I believe many anarchists disagree with that, consider that to be a very elitist statement. They believe the working class is capable of spontaneously moving toward revolutionary ideas. Yeah. Is that accurate?
I think that's very accurate. And I think it goes to show usually the difference in temperament between a socialist who expresses their socialistic values from a more anarchistic temperament and one who goes from a more Marxist temperament. Because I think in a lot of ways, you and I talked and we mentioned that the big difference in socialism is almost one of emphasis. Like they're not super different, but like it's what they choose to emphasize at certain times that really seems to set them apart into different parties. Would you agree with that?
Oh, totally. And the goal is obviously the same, a stateless, classless world. The question is just how to get there.
Yeah, I would agree entirely. Now, Durruti's best friend, a guy by the name of Ascaso, he and Durruti, they had a vigorous friendship, and they were active collaborators. They were both anarchists, and they would form two out of the three of Durruti's big 3-people anarchist group. Now, this is going to kind of fly in the face of my characterization of Durruti as possibly manic depressive. Because it says Ascaso was thin and high strung. Durruti was athletic and calm. The former was suspicious and seemed unpleasant at first. The latter was extraordinarily friendly. Cold calculation, rationality, and skepticism were characteristics of Ascaso. Durruti was passionate and optimistic. Durruti fully gave himself over to the friendship from the start, while Ascaso was reserved until he got to know people better. These two revolutionaries forged a deep trust, and great projects grew from the dialogue between them. Now, I really like this characterization of the two of them because it shows, in my opinion, two people who are very, very different, who were still united in a goal where they kind of balance each other like yin and yang. Have you seen dynamics like that in other revolutionary leaders and their closest friends? Can you think of any?
No, actually, I feel like friendships often develop that way, right? People learn to kind of dance, right? And it takes people a while working together, like you and I, right? I mean, we've learned, we've done so many of these streams. We know how to bounce off each other after a while. And that's just kind of how working relationships, friendships, political relationships tend to work, is that you kind of learn, at first when you dance with somebody, someone's going to step on somebody's feet. It's a little bit awkward, but after you had a dance partner for a while, you know exactly what the other person's going to do. And you learn to do it. And that kind of rhythm is very essential. And when you can get political organizations where you have that, there's kind of a division of labor that develops and everyone kind of is able to play off each other and everyone's strengths is able to come forward. That's kind of the magical success formula, right? But the question is, are you able to actually do that? Because rivalries happen. Now, it's interesting. I recently saw that there's a new book that's been published called The Guru Papers. And it talked about the development of political cults and political organizations. And it talked about how there's actually two stages. There's the stage of ascendancy, when the group is new and getting a lot of things done and expanding. And things tend to work very, very well in that period. But the problems in revolutionary organizations tend to set in after things are not expanding anymore, right? After the group, the recruitment has leveled out, and that you can even look at the Soviet Union, right? When the Soviet Union was new and revolutionary, was much more vibrant. There were much more factions, but then some of the more authoritarian stuff happened after things tampered down, and that often, when groups are in a group period of expansion, when there's a lot of people in the streets protesting and stuff, revolutionary organizations function a lot better. People are just happier. But it's when you get into a darker period that the clashes happen. And sometimes it's the moment that makes those relationships more than anything. When people really see a reward and a definite outcome of what they're doing, when it feels like they can really accomplish something, all of a sudden people work together better. People can get things done. People's strengths show up. People are not competing with one another. It's not like a competition, and everyone can just kind of do what they want to do. But then when you enter a period where you're not seeing any success, that's when people kind of turn on each other and you get a lot of factionalism and disagreement.
That makes a lot of sense. I think it was, who was it? Was it Truman? Not Truman. Wilson. Woodrow Wilson said that he had a harder time being the president of Yale than he did being the president of the United States.
That's awful.
Yeah. But it's like when the stakes are lower, people do seem to get more factionalized, and when the shit hits the fan, you can often see some of the best and worst in human nature come out. So this and this goes back to so Durruti in this period here prior to the revolution, when he gets like really, really big, it's noted that like Durruti had a dynamic temperament, and there was nothing more contrary to his nature than idleness. Inactivity was torturous for him, and when the circumstances forced it upon him, he tried to release his energy in 1,000 different ways. So a good example of this, and that I think is kind of funny, but it gives you an insight into his character, is that when he arrived in Madrid, he discovered that the conference he had to attend had been postponed for a week, and this disrupted his plans. This was an anarchist radical conference he was going to, but he took advantage of this time to accomplish part of his mission by visiting a friend of his, whom he had sorted out the medal for. Who he had to sort out a matter of the trial noted above. So there was a trial that was going on at the time. His friend, Buenaventura, didn't recognize him at first. Durruti was going around dressed like an Englishman, disfiguring his face with some thick-framed glasses. Durruti asked him about the status of the trial and delivered some money for legal costs. He then said he wanted to go see the inmates. Buenaventura did everything he could to dissuade Durruti, saying that it was too risky and a good way to get himself locked up, because Durruti at this time was already wanted, I believe, for an attack that took the life of one of the archbishops of Zaragoza, actually. And we'll go into that in just a minute. But Durruti would not be deterred while he's running around in this like Groucho Marx disguise. A visit, he said, would raise the prisoner's morale, and his friend finally acceded, hoping that the jailers would take him for some strange tourist, given his foreign outfit. Now, Durruti actually did manage to go to the prison dressed as an Englishman. He did manage to talk, and the jailers were just like, who the hell is this weirdo? Okay, whatever. So he was actually totally right. But what wound up happening was that after his trip to the prison, the police surprised Durruti from behind while he was walking on Alcala Street. He considered resisting, but realized he was completely surrounded. They promptly threw him in a car and shot off towards police headquarters. They confirmed his identity at the police station and charged him with 3 crimes. 1, the armed robbery of a trader from San Sebastian, the plot to kill Alphonse XIII, the king of Spain, and desertion from the army. Which he had been conscripted into the army and had deserted for obvious reasons. The newspapers in Madrid and Barcelona raved about Durruti's detention, declaring him one of Spain's leading terrorists and cheering that he had finally been captured. Indeed, the crime report makes him out to be an extraordinary figure. They described him as a consummate bank robber, trained bandit, and dangerous terrorist, and above all, an unbalanced mind with the signs of a born criminal, a perfect example of what the criminologist Lombarzo advanced in his outrageous study on anarchists. Now, I'm not familiar with Lombarzo exactly, but I am familiar with kind of like this sort of criminology background. So what's important to understand about Durruti during this period, right up to his capture here, is that he has been sort of almost an Osama bin Laden figure to the Spanish upper class. He carried out the attack on the motorcade that claimed the life of the Archbishop of Zaragoza. He attempted to attack the king's motorcade, and he also was responsible for a number of crimes and bank robberies and heists, all of which were being used to fund the revolution. So, he's already on the wrong side of the law here, and it seems like everybody, aside from those who know him, are very much against him. Now, does this sound, is there anything, because I know Stalin was a bank robber in his youth, but beyond Stalin, like, is this a common story for revolutionary people during these periods?
Well, until now, I didn't realize that he had been organizing in an underground, clandestine manner. Now, I'm curious, is this simply because he engaged in these acts of violence, these bank robberies, this assassination plots, or was it simply that one could not, was there no freedom of speech in Spain at this time? Could one legally organize for socialism or not?
I'm under the impression that one could not. Spain had some incredibly restrictive laws. Spain at this time was like, women were not allowed to go out unaccompanied by men. It was like Saudi Arabia, so Spain had some pretty nasty laws. Now, also due to this with Durruti, I mean, like, this is the time of Pistolerismoism. And anybody who's listening to this can look this up. Like, what's really important to understand about this period in Spanish history is that this is the level of class antagonism is something that we in the first world don't really see today and don't understand. So there were company unions, yellow unions, that the bosses in Spain would force people to join. So it would be a union set up by the boss, and the whole purpose of this union was to prevent strikes. And not only that, but the union itself was full of people who weren't actually workers, but were in fact assassins that were hired. And what they would do is they would listen in on the other meetings with the workers, or if anybody came up to them and talked to them about the possibility of striking or taking any kind of action against the boss, they'd take him out back and shoot him in the head. So like, that's how this is. Imagine just imagine for a second having that relationship with your employer and with your fellow workers. That, like, if you're a worker at Amazon and you don't know if the worker next to you is really a worker or if he's a gangster that's going to kill you if you say something. And Jeff Bezos, it's known that he has these people hired and peppered like throughout the Amazon factories. Now at the time also, like, so Durruti has formed a group with Francisco Escaso, who I already talked about, and also Garcia Oliver, who they sort of formed like the triad that was known as Los Solidarios. And this was sort of like Durruti's kind of primary anarchist group. They're also like with the Los Solidarios, they were also known as Los Justicarios, I think is how you pronounce it. I don't speak Spanish, but essentially, and this is the fun part, the three of them were known as the Avengers. And when I was like, when I was writing the screenplay, I was like, oh man, I know, I'll call this the Avengers. Ah, shit. So like, Los Solidarios, the Solidarity or the Avengers, I mean, these were the people who came up with the plot against the numerous figures, including the assassination of the Archbishop of Zaragoza. Now, it's also important to know that the Archbishop of Zaragoza was not just some random archbishop. He was known to not only be like involved in like prostitution schemes, but he was also known to be one of the people directing a lot of political assassinations, because at this point, political assassinations are going back and forth and back and forth. So, it can sound really shocking when there's like, oh my God, they killed an archbishop. But it's also important to remember that, one, in Spain at this time, the church was not just the church. They were directly tied in with the state. And also the church was not of one mind. I mean, when Franco was there were priests and nuns that sided with the Republic, and Franco massacred them. Yeah. So really, like, the church in this period is 100% a combatant. So Durruti spends a number of years in and out of jail. They really have a hard time kind of getting the charges to stick with him, partially because sometimes he's captured in other countries and sometimes he's captured within Spain. Also, that like there's a huge anarchist movement that is behind him and making sure to do the kind of jail support things that they need to keep him more or less out of trouble. So this was what I was actually talking about. The Vox Populi, which was a publication at the time, accused the Archbishop of patronizing gambling houses and being responsible for protecting the pistoleros. Those were the people who were killing workers left and right. And there were even rumors of his weekly orgies in a certain nuns' covenant, which sounds to me like political propaganda, but who knows? I wouldn't put it past him. He was truly one of the most hated people in Aragon. Ascaso felt that by eliminating him, they would put some order in the bourgeoisie disorder that was currently sweeping the city. So, once Durruti and them all and Ascaso are arrested for this particular crime, there's a bunch of stuff coming out in the press. But what's incredible is that the CNT is like 100% behind the people who are taken in. And so the CNT union warned that even if one innocent worker is arrested, the authorities and no one else would bear responsibility for what might happen. And as for what might happen, you can see this is a very tense situation. I
read your screenplay, and it very much had a very Wild West character about it. Even though this is not in the United States, it's in Spain, and even though it's it's got all this political stuff and all of that, and you get the impression that there was a higher level of just kind of disorder in society during this time, where it's like they can't arrest this guy because there's this union that's backing him up and they don't want the risk with that. And that as much as there was brutal repression going on, which you're describing, there also was like resistance on such a higher level that there was like pushback. And one thing that also occurred to me, which I think is interesting, is it seemed, I'm sure there were divisions among the Spanish ruling class, right?
Definitely.
That this feudal hangover and the power of these bishops is something that a lot of capitalists probably didn't like either. And that often, especially these kind of clandestine organizations that engage in assassinations, which you said were going on both sides. And, you almost wonder if there were people within the ruling class who were kind of covertly protecting him also. Maybe they didn't agree with anarchism, but they were hoping that he would lead to a situation that loosened the feudal restraints on society. Do you think that's possible at all?
I think that's definitely possible. Abel Paz doesn't go into that in his biography, but the thing is that actual like revolutions need money to function, and they can't all be financed by bank robberies. So I think absolutely. Now, there was a situation that I wanted to get into, and this actually made it into my screenplay. Here is that there was a raid after the Archbishop was murdered. There was a raid ordered on June 28th. It was ordered against other anarcho-syndicalist leaders on terrorism charges. Now, the allegation of terrorism charges rested on a supposedly secret flyer that was distributed in the barracks, warning soldiers that their superiors were planning a coup and urging them to make common cause with the people. Now, we don't know if this flyer was real or not. That was the pretext for the police to go after the anarcho-syndicalist union leaders. However, what we do know is that this was actually happening. There was a coup being planned by Franco and Goded and a number of officers within the Spanish military, and they were already talking back and forth with Hitler and Mussolini as to how they would take over this country. So it's amazing that the fascists, or at least the people serving the fascists who are against the workers at this point, use the distribution of a flyer that essentially did rightly call them out for their plot as the pretext to lock up a number of CNT anarcho-syndicalist union leaders.
And this points to kind of what I was getting at before about the kind of Wild West nature of the society. Like, this guy is wanted for assassinating government officials and they can't arrest him. But then somebody puts up, he handed out a leaflet. We got him, Yeah. I mean, it just shows that it's all just a matter of balance of forces, right? That there were these anarchist unions, there were these left-wing organizers, and they had guns and they had support and they had strongholds. There were these, forces that were with the state and with the ruling class, with the aristocracy, and they had their forces. And it was all just a matter of the balance of forces at the time, who had the upper hand, right? And that the legality was kind of vanishing. And in a lot of the developing world, it's very much like that. You know what I mean? It's like I've been to countries they say are so authoritarian, and I see blatant anti-government agitation going on very, very visibly. But then I also hear about somebody doing almost nothing and going to jail for it. And it's not really about what they did. It's about the balance of forces at the time. And that tends to be in societies where you don't have a strong legalistic tradition. It becomes more and more like might is right. Who has the most guns at this time, who has the upper hand, who's well connected enough. And it is much more like that. And that just comes across here, that the leaflet is not tolerable, but an assassin can't go to jail. It points to how ridiculous the rule of law can be in some cases.
Absolutely. And it also, what's interesting here is that, we have accusations in the United States that certain forces within our government are working against others. The FBI is against Trump and maybe the CIA is for him, that kind of thing. And what's interesting is this did happen in a big way in Spain, where there were essentially two major police forces. There were what were called the assault guards. Their primary duty was essentially to be police officers in the cities. And then there were also, there was another police force that was primarily the police force in the country. The police force in the country was fascist. The assault guards were socialist. And so when things got to the Spanish Civil War with these people fighting each other, you had two different police forces, each trying to kill the other and also carrying out assassinations against each other, each other's political leaders. There were times that in a reprisal, a fascist politician might have a knock at his door, and he opens the door and boom, there's 6 assault guards being we got to take you down to the station for questioning. Or the inverse happens. And it's amazing to see a country kind of tear itself apart like that. And it really makes you think back to that Dali painting about the Spanish Civil War that literally has the giant ripping itself apart. That really very much is the feeling in Spain. But before we move on a little bit, what I wanted to tell you about...
A little bit familiar, though, isn't it? I mean, that's kind of... I really hope things don't continue on that road right now, because in the United States, it's starting to seem that way. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just couldn't help but interject.
Absolutely. No, I think you're totally, you're totally right. And it is seeming like we are getting closer to that point. I like to think that we're further away from it than it was in Spain, because you got to remember, we've been going through this in a very big way since the election of Donald Trump. I mean, there was stuff before it, but you remember, with Occupy, when the left was in the streets and Obama was there was violence, the person got his head split by a gas canister, but nobody died. There weren't killings and reprisal killings, and people weren't carrying out suicide attacks against, protesters, or I guess legal suicide attacks. What I mean, the people who seem to be attacking. This is all allegedly. I can't say for sure. We'll have it worked out in the court. But I'm talking about Rittenhouse and stuff, where they seem like they want to attack the protesters and then claim self-defense later. There was also the attack in Texas that was like that, but that never happened when we were in the street with Occupy.
No.
So, and the level of violence that I'm talking about, like with this, has been going on for like 10, 20 years at this point. So that I take a little bit of comfort from that. But I did want to bring this up because this is actually in my script, and I think if somebody reads my script about Durruti, or when the comic book comes out, reads the comic book, they might get to this point in the script and think, oh, Brent's just making that up. So I'm going to read this directly. So the church pressed the federal government of Zaragoza authorities to apprehend the well-known anarchist Esteban Arterio Salaman. I just call him Esteban in the script. I have a guy named after him. He's got like 4 names. And Juliana Lopez Miramar as accomplices to the crime. Unable to find the former, that would be Esteban, and unable to find Esteban, the police seized his mother instead, and the elderly woman, who was an elderly woman in her 70s. Authorities declared that they would hold her as hostage until her son turned himself in. They had yanked her out of bed when she was sick with tuberculosis. 12 hours after the news of this outrageous detention broke, Esteban Salamero turned himself over to Zaragoza police. He said that he had, quote, nothing to fear from the law and demanded his mother's release. The police tried to coerce Salamero into confessing his complicity in the murder by beating his 70-year-old mother right in front of him. Yep. He was unable to endure this and signed a confession, although the police's tactics later became public knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that scene is in my script, but like that's the society we're dealing with. This is what Durruti has been born into, this kind of crumbling ruin of Spain.
Yeah.
So Durruti spends these years evading the law, being kept out of, the crosshairs of law enforcement, in and out of jail, in and out of the military. There's one point when he has been captured and they're going to deport him to the Canary Isles, which oddly enough had been another place that Franco had been stationed. And what they wound up doing was, this was after Durruti's daughter, Colette, had been born. They wrote like a note to Durruti's, not wife, but partner, Emilian, like on his daughter's diaper, and passed it like from the ship to her. But somehow, like each time they tried to keep him in prison, like it just would not stick. Mm-hmm. He wound up being imprisoned in France for a little while, and this is like sort of, we're getting into more what I go over in my movie about Durruti. In that, he stays in a French jail for quite some time. The French anarchist movement is really behind him being released, and the law says that you cannot hold a foreign national in prison for a foreign crime for more than 30 days. At this time, there is actually a steamship coming from Argentina. And what the French authorities intend to do is to transfer Durruti, Ascaso, and Oliver, all 3 of whom have been in prison for a month, to the ship, take them back to Argentina, and execute them. Because Durruti had gone essentially from Spain to France, from France to the United States very briefly. Then he wound up in Cuba. In Cuba, he and his compatriots set about carrying out reprisal attacks against bosses that were seen as being like particularly brutal towards the people working under them. And Durruti left Cuba very frustrated, and had actually remarked that he couldn't believe how cowed the Cuban people were, and that they would never revolt. So I'm glad he was wrong on that subject. Yeah. But it's interesting to see how certain times, like how quickly conditions in countries can change. Durruti left from Cuba and went to Mexico. And one of the stories about his time in Mexico, which I really, really loved, was that he went to meet a friend downtown. And he asked to meet the friend at like the nicest restaurant in town. And the guy goes to the restaurant and he's very uncomfortable. He sees Durruti in this like really super nice suit. The remembering Durruti's passion for ridiculous disguises. He comes up to him and he says, I don't understand, I'm an anarchist. I'm not comfortable among high society in this restaurant. And Durruti's like, no, dude, I'm undercover. Like, nobody's going to look for me here. And they proceeded to have a conversation. And this guy at the time was, he mentions to Durruti in this lunch that he's looking to start a school in Mexico, but he needs money for it. And Durruti's like, okay, you need money? Okay. I'll tell you what, meet me in a couple of days. And a few days later, he comes back and Durruti hands him an envelope with 1,000 pesetos in it. And he's like, this is what you needed, right? And the guy's like, yeah. How did you get this? And he's like, oh, I robbed a textile factory. So, I mean, like, that was the kind of guy that Durruti was. He'd hear that somebody needed something and just go out and do it for them. And, by extra legal means. But again, remember the time period, remember exactly what's going on. They wound up fleeing Spain and went to Argentina. The Argentinians, having heard of Durruti's exploits, immediately made him like one of the most wanted people in the country, and put him on a boat. Immediately went trying to execute him. And so he immediately had to leave, went back to France. That was where he was captured. So that's what's important to understand about this Argentinian steamship that's coming to get him and Ascaso and Oliver. And their intent is to hand him over to the Argentine authorities, and the Argentine authorities are just going to execute all three of them. This is around the time, perhaps a little after, the Americans had executed... what were the two? I'm blanking on them. Yeah, Sacco and Vanzetti. Yeah. This was around the time. So anarchists were getting executed left and right by authorities. However, the steamship was late. And because the steamship was late, and because there was such a popular groundswell in France, Durruti was freed.
Well, this was what year?
This was right before, I'm not sure the exact year, but this was right before the Spanish Civil War started. The Civil War started in 1936.
Right, because I know France had the Popular Front government for a while, right, in the mid-30s. They had elected a government that was the Socialist Party and the Communist Party aligned, and briefly had an anti-fascist alliance with the Soviet Union. So it would make sense that if there was some popular Spanish figure who was known to be on the side of progressive forces, they might release him. They might let him go. That might make sense at that time. I know Trotsky was given exile status in France for a little while. He lived in France for a little while, and eventually moved to Mexico. And, you mentioned Mexico, and that's the interesting thing. At the time he went to Cuba, Cuba was this, place where the people were not very awakened. But probably at that time, Mexico was probably a place full of activism and militancy coming out of the Mexican Revolution and all of that. And Trotsky eventually moved to Mexico, too. That's where he was killed. And that Mexico had this revolutionary tradition of big labor groups and big communist groups. And there had been the Mexican Revolution that had involved landless peasants rising up and all of that. And so, it's interesting how the revolutionary energy goes from one place to another place to another place, and that give it 10 or 20 years, the energy in a place will completely change. It will just completely change.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And France, also because France had this culture of revolution, going back to the French Revolution. And anarchism in a lot of ways grew out of the more radical currents of the French Revolution. I think that's where a lot of the major, even though aside from Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a lot of the major anarchist thinkers were not French. I mean, there was Joseph de Jacques, but those are more obscure names known by the anarchists, as opposed to Peter Kropotkin was Russian, Mikhail Bakunin. Forget where he was from. I don't think he was French. I know he died trying to lead a revolt in Lyon.
Yeah, well, there were a number of I don't know if you want to call them left communist or I guess ultra left or figures that Marx thought were too radical in France. There was Louis Auguste Blanqui was one of those figures, and his followers were very key in the Paris Commune. There was Ferdinand Lassalle. And he was also quite a prominent figure, and that there were a lot of French revolutionary small c communists who did not like Karl Marx. There was the Paris Commune of 1871, which Marxists considered to be the first dictatorship of the proletariat, which was this temporary seizure of power in Paris. And that there was this whole, network of cafes and bookshops and such in France. Paris was very much the center of like the revolutionary intelligentsia of Europe up until the Second World War, I would say. It was in Paris was where, and Marx, when he was in exile in Paris, arguing with the left Hegelians, and that there was this whole culture in France of kind of tolerating the left as part of a necessary part of society. Even people on the right kind of felt like, well, it was just part of their French identity to have revolutionaries and students screaming revolution and such.
Which is why, Victor Hugo publishes, I think back to like Les Miserables. And he publishes Les Miserables in France. Can you imagine like the reaction on like Fox News if a story like Les Miserables was published here in the United States with like the themes that it has and the heroes that it has? Like,
well, I don't know. I mean, the thing is, if you look at that work, the way a lot of people understand that work through the lens of the Broadway musical that came out in the 60s, right? And that musical is very, very left, and it really emphasizes the student revolutionaries, and it really kind of shows the horrors of post-feudal France as being, the results of capitalism. But I think when Victor Hugo wrote it, he was coming at it from more of a Charles Dickens place, where it was like he had to talk about the student revolutionaries because they were definitely an aspect of French society. You couldn't escape them. They had to have a role in his story, but he viewed them as kind of young and naive. And it was like he was showing the horrors of prostitution. He was showing the horrors of the factories. He was going through French society and showing all these horrors. But it's like the way the novel ends, it's like the answer is to just be a good person and be religious and always do the right thing. And morality and the law don't walk hand in hand, as the whole plot of the officer Javert chasing him around kind of shows. I don't think Victor Hugo meant it to be, what the 1960s musical made it out to be. The 1960s musical was very much far left. And I mean, it was a critique of capitalism. I mean, Charles Dickens, for goodness sakes, Scrooge, what is Scrooge? He's an evil capitalist who is screwing over his tenants and throwing people out on the street in the middle of winter to freeze and won't give his workers Christmas Day off. And then he's visited at night and shown about what an awful person he is. And then he changes his ways. These are kind of, during the Industrial Revolution, there were a lot of stories like that, bemoaning the horrors of the modern times. What's unique about that Victor Hugo novel is it does touch on revolutionaries, right? It does touch on revolutionaries and it shows them, but I don't think Victor Hugo meant to show them in a completely positive light. It was kind of like, this is an aspect of what you have when you have capitalism, is you have rich middle-class guys who want to form barricades and overthrow the old order. I think that's what he was getting at. What do you think?
I think to it does make sense. It's kind of tough, like when you talk about big things like revolution. It puts people in a difficult position because, on one hand, there's these intolerable conditions that are happening, but then on the other hand, it's how do you respond to that as an ethical individual who doesn't want to hurt anyone? And we talked about this when we were talking about Homage to Catalonia with Bobby. He was talking about how just about everybody's social conditioning pushes them that they don't want to hurt anyone. And oftentimes, it takes a lot of work for militaries to get people to actually shoot at a person as opposed to shooting above their head. It's one of the things that I actually really like about people, in that you kind of have to push a person into that situation unless they're like some kind of sociopath. So when you talk about revolution and like revolutionary violence, like it's really important to, I guess, understand the socio-political context in which it takes place, that really takes these people and pushes them to this point. The Spanish upper class at the time was exceptionally cruel. In fact, the Lincoln Brigade, which were Americans who went over to fight for the Spanish Republic, on the side of the communists and the anarchists, and what liberal centrists remained. There were some African-American nurses that came over, and they were shocked at the level of class hatred of the peasantry and of the working class that were displayed by the Spanish upper class. I mean, I've said this before. The Spanish upper class would literally hunt peasants on horseback and murder them. It was called Reforma Agraria, and they literally said that, like, I have never seen this level of hatred that's not race based. You know. Like one of the things that during the actual Spanish Civil War, one of the things that one of the fascist generals was quoted as saying was that what was wrong with Spain is modern plumbing, because in spiritually better times we could count on disease to kill these vermin. Meaning the peasants and the workers, but they are, because they're not dying enough from disease, they're definitely getting infected by the disease of Bolshevism, and who can blame it? Rats carry the plague, peasants carry Marxism, and like that's the attitude that they had, which is horrifying. But you can see some people, like you look at some of the QAnon memes that come out and some of like the really, really nutso Trump people, like there is among some of them like a horniness to kill their fellow man because they think, they're part of some other tribe. It's horrifying and disgusting.
Well, it's about reinforcing social hierarchy. I mean, that's really the fascist goal, right? As much as they sometimes will demagogically condemn capitalism and talk about the working man or whatever, at the end of the day, they're about reinforcing social hierarchy. They're about keeping, some kind of order in existence, and that's what they're about. And so they see that, any inspiration of people to rise up and resist their conditions is like a cancer in society that needs to be rooted out. It's interesting because the Latin American countries, you will get that kind of blatant classism, often mixed in with racism among like the cartoons that came out portraying Hugo Chavez like a monkey. Because he had some African heritage. Hugo Chavez wasn't that dark skinned, but because he had some African heritage, like, the Venezuelan opposition would portray him as a monkey. I mean, just stuff like that you don't, you don't see over here. I mean, you see it, but it's not as like upfront in your face. What I also thought was interesting is Harry Haywood, who is the author of the book Black Bolshevik, who was a leader of the Communist Party. He fought in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, but he was black. And he talked about how, because he was black in Spain, he was viewed with high suspicion. Because a number of Franco's soldiers were black, because Franco had been in North Africa, and that really kind of turned everything on its head. You said this group of black nurses who fought with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, they were shocked at the level of bigotry and didn't see it as racially linked. And it was like the fascists had no problem having black divisions of fighters on their side. And so then, unfortunately, there's even like some Spanish Civil War songs for the Republic that are kind of racist. And it was like they associated Africans with working for Franco. And so it's all just confused. It shows how in different contexts, everything gets jumbled up. The racists and fascists want to tell you there's this eternal way. Whites are always like this. Blacks are always like this. That's not true. I mean, they're in different contexts, people act differently.
Yeah, well, no, you're totally right. And the thing is that Franco, I can see why they might have that attitude, because Franco using his Moroccan troops, they would use rape as a weapon, and rape at the hands of the Moroccan troops as a weapon. Famously, was painted on the side of like some barns and some warehouses were like in towns that were more sympathetic to the Republic, was like your women will give birth to fascists. There was a lot of sexual violence carried out by the fascists against the women of Spain. If I'm not mistaken, in one town in particular, this is in Adam Hochschild's Spain in Our Hearts, they raped and murdered all the women in the town, threw their bodies down a well, and then paraded around the town with their undergarments strung off their bayonets.
Wow.
These people were absolute monsters, and this is one of the things that I like about Durruti. Like, we've been talking, this is like Durruti the Bandit kind of, we've been talking about for a little over an hour now. But like, when you get into Durruti the military leader, Durruti the hero, we really see that he's a man who saw this incredible darkness. And a lot of people's reaction to that would be to just give up hope.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, what Durruti did was he looked at this and he said, instead of giving up hope on humanity, he chose to believe so strongly in the inherent goodness of humanity that he fought and killed and died for it. And it's contradictory, but it's contradictory in a very beautiful way that I find still kind of gets me right here down through the ages. Now, we've been at this for a little while, so I don't want to keep you too long. So what we could do is I could move into the rest of Durruti's story. We could go for another 30 minutes and I could really speed up here, or we could do another stream later where I go a little more in depth. How do you feel about it?
Well, we can go for a little while longer, but why don't we do 2 parts? So we give this guy all the justice he deserves, right? I mean, I think, if you want to finish it off for tonight, find a good place to stop, and then we'll do part 2.
That sounds good to me.
Or the next night.
Yeah. I think 2 parts is a good thing. The book splits it into 3 essentially, but what I'll tell you. So Durruti gets out of he gets out of jail in in France. And he's basically told on his way out of jail, you got to get out of France. So Durruti then is looking around trying to figure out where to go next. Does he go back to Spain, where he is very much a wanted man and they're going to be waiting for him at the border? He was actually extended an official invitation by Joseph Stalin to come to the USSR. However, there were a number of problems. He actually did try to take Joseph Stalin up on that. He did try to go to the USSR, but there were problems with his passport, and basically it got to a point where he got spooked, where I think he wasn't sure if it was a real invitation or if the Russians were mad at him for some reason, or if there was just some bureaucrat that was like, no, you don't have your papers in order. You can't go to Russia.
Right.
What he wound up doing then was he met with the famous anarchist Nestor Makhno, who was also living in France, because as you mentioned earlier, France was the part where revolutionaries were very much tolerated for a long period of time. Nestor Makhno had been the leader of the Black Army, which had been allied with the Red Army, and then they'd entered into 2 alliances with the Red Army during the Russian Revolution, and then that went south. A number of Red Army leaders a number of Black Army leaders were put into jail, and Nestor Makhno was forced to flee to France. Makhno is now in his 40s. He was I think in his 20s, maybe early 30s when he was leading the Black Army. And he met with Durruti and essentially told Durruti that Spain was where the world revolution would really begin, that they had hoped that it would be the Ukraine, and that this time it was not going to be strangled in its cradle. It's incredible to me that 2 of the most famous anarchist militant leaders actually met each other, and that how small and connected the world was becoming at this point because of, I guess, the locomotive and the motor car and everything, that somebody from the Ukraine could meet somebody like Durruti from Spain. I mean, are you familiar too much with this period here? Or do you have anything to throw in there?
It's actually kind of not really surprising because, these capitals in Europe, Vienna, London, Paris, I mean, this is where revolutionaries went. People are really surprised to know that Mussolini and Trotsky and Lenin had met several times prior to the Russian Revolution and prior to Mussolini becoming a fascist, because Mussolini was an Italian socialist and they were Russian socialists, and they were in exile, and they had met each other at gatherings and events, and they ended up becoming, bitter enemies, but they had all known each other because it was a very small kind of network of, and there were just certain places revolutionaries went to. certain cities and certain cafes and certain coffee shops and such. The other thing is that I think that anarchism, nowadays anarchism is very, maybe not as much as it once was, but anarchism was very trendy for a while. I think I remember Anti-Flag, the punk band, calling yourself an anarchist was a very trendy thing. But at this time, you have to remember that the socialist parties were in the government everywhere. They were like the ruling parties in a lot of countries. The communist parties existed and were very, very big. But anarchism was kind of a smaller milieu, right? And that it was like, you describe him, he sounds like, I don't mean this in a derogatory way. It's just a description. He sounds like what Marxists might call a left adventurist, right? He was doing exciting, bold acts, that would help the revolutionary movement. Not many people do that for obvious reasons. And so the kind of people that did the kind of things that Maupin and Durruti did was probably not a very big group of people. And that there were probably a lot of people in the communist parties and in the socialist parties who kind of liked them and were like fans. They were officially in a different political group, but they would do some assassination or some robbery and they would kind of applaud. And it was kind of like that with the Weathermen in the 1960s. Very few people actually became members of the Weather Underground, but there was this wide anti-war movement activist group. They'd hear that the Weathermen had blown up some building and they would applaud and, right on, brother, or something like that. And that tends to be how kind of, forces like that tend to operate. You can't have a big organization if you're going to be doing things like that, right? So these kind of underground groups that are engaging in illegal activity, they tend to go for, like, it sounds like he had kind of a Bonnie and Clyde reputation, right? He was political, unlike, but this is the age of the 1930s where in the United States you had Pretty Boy Floyd, who was a bank robber, who was like a household hero. You had Machine Gun Kelly, and that, when they would execute some bank robber, there'd be all kinds of people like, crying for them because they killed bankers or something. It was a period where people kind of admired, it was the height of the social bandit, the Robin Hood. You know what I mean? And media was new. You had radio broadcasts and stuff. So somebody going around and fighting the authorities in a very exciting, provocative way would really capture people's attention. And I think so there probably weren't many people doing the kinds of things he did, even though there was a huge base of people that probably admired people who did things that he did. And so that would make it. And then there were probably networks of safe houses he could hide at and things like that. It wouldn't surprise me if anarchists in exile, there probably weren't that many of them and they were able to meet. That's just kind of my perception of the era. I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, I know just what you mean. And like, the thing is that, again, I kind of look at this because the world back then was so different than the world today. It does seem like we're starting to teeter back towards that, as you pointed out. But like, I very much see people like Durruti as being products of their time. And definitely he was like one of the rare individuals who would actually go out and do this stuff. But also, he, beyond the fun left adventurism things that he would do, where, sort of the exciting kind of Durruti, Durruti, the international Robin Hood, you also have stuff like, like here, for instance, if I can get this, here's Durruti speaking in Leon. He was very much heavily involved in the unions. He often was known to remark, like, even during the war, he would talk about how the spade and the pickaxe were just as important as the gun. And how the anarchists were not simply fighting for like hollow slogans, but for conquest of the land, the bread, and culture. Like, they very much there were two sides to the man in a lot of ways. And like, we'll definitely get into that as we get further into Durruti the Revolutionary. And I think that really happens, and he begins to get into the revolutionary character when he returns to Spain. So I think what we'll probably do is we'll end this as part one. All and right. In the next couple of days, we'll do part two, and we'll talk about like Durruti the Revolutionary and really get into his conflict with the fascists, with the General Goded and the defense of Barcelona against the Spanish fascist military as they engage in the coup. Because, as we established previously, like the flyer that they used to go after the anarchists was pointing out a plot that was real. at
Yeah.
the time. So do you have any thoughts before we move on from the stream?
No, it just sounds like a very exciting story, and I feel like we've been setting up by getting kind of the scene tonight. We've been kind of setting the scene for what's to come. You know, we've gotten an impression of who the man was, his reputation. We've gotten an impression for how brutal the society he was in was, and now I think the next live we'll get into the actual meat and bones of the adventure that you describe in your screenplay.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you want to plug your pluggables for the audience? Where can people find you?
Hey, I'm on YouTube, Caleb Maupin. I got a new book out on Kamala Harris. You should buy it. Kamala Harris and the Future of America. Check it out. Yeah, that's all. That's it. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, yeah,
look him up, and I'll have your link in the description. I didn't link your YouTube channel.
Sure.
And for me, please like and subscribe. You're on my YouTube channel right now, so you found me. I have a comic book Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, which is nominated for 2 Ringo Awards. The channel just passed 1,000 subscribers. I'm really excited about that. And I will be either later tonight or tomorrow, I'm going to be, to celebrate passing 1,000 subscribers, I'm going to be reading a poem by Neil Gaiman, which I'm really, really excited. He's one of my favorite authors. So look forward to that. All right, so we're going to bring this to a close, and thank you guys so much for coming out and listening to the first part of the story of Buenaventura Durruti.
All right, great.